My name is Penny Bonnett, and I'm your host this evening, and I'm welcoming you to the home of Mr. Herb Harrop here in Nelson. And I'm going to, I think, learn a lot of history from Mr. Harrop. Herb, your father came into the area many years ago.
Yes.
I know very little of the history of this area, and I wonder if you can begin to tell us, how did the first Harrop arrive here, and where did he arrive?
Well, it would take me a long time to tell you everything about it, because he came into this country, I think it was around in the 60s, you see.
This is 1860.
Yeah.
Right.
And he worked for the CPR, you see.
Okay.
He was raised, of course, in the old country, and came from a pretty good family there, and they had a little bit of money, but they sent him out here, and he arrived in Winnipeg.
Was he a young fellow at that time?
At that time, he was about, I would say, 18.
Okay, right.
And in Winnipeg, he hired on with the CPR to drive supplies out to Calgary. And they had one of these ox two-wheel carts, you know.
Right.
And they used to have one horse in the shaft and one on the outside. And they were not steel wheels on in those days because they didn't have any steel, enough steel in this country. They were using all the steel for the railroads and things like that. And there was over 60 of these things in the one outfit that he came with. And they started out, and they they would make about 10 miles a day. That's all they'd make. They'd change horses at noon, you see,
Right.
to give one horse a rest, you see, and go on. And finally they arrived in Calgary.
Right, okay.
And according to his contract with the CPR would have paid his way back to Winnipeg, you see. So he made a deal with them to give him the money, and he came on through to Pincher Creek.
Right, okay, in southern Alberta.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he spent the first winter there with the Royal Mounted Police. He didn't join up, he was just a sort of a stable boy. He looked after the horses and one thing and another. And he stayed the first winter there. And in the early spring there was, I guess there was the Real Rebellion, or the previous to the Real Rebellion, this other guy, what was his name?
Dumont, maybe?
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Dumont, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they were going to have this rebellion, but it never really happened. Anyways, the Frog Lake massacre came along, and the police that he was with started for there. But before they got there, the massacre had happened, and so he turned back and came out, and he came up to Beavermouth.
Whereabouts is Beavermouth?
Beavermouth is in British Columbia.
Okay, right,
And
we're getting closer.
that was the CPR. And he got a job as assistant timekeeper for one of the contractors, you see there. And he was there with a guy called Frank Tietzel. Frank Tietzel was the paymaster. And this was the time that they were having trouble with no pay. The CPR was short, and Donald wasn't too busy drinking, I guess, to send any money out. And Van Horn was, you know. But anyways, apparently when they paid the guys, they worked, it's all station work, you see. And their stations were all owned by the same company. So the guys were on a spot. They would get their timesheet, you know, how to say that they had so much money coming. But they'd come down to get their money, and there was no money. And they couldn't get out of town. They couldn't say, well, to hell with you, I'm going into cavalry or something like that, because they would just notify the next station down there that this guy's coming down, don't give him anything to eat. Well, anyways, apparently this thing built up to the stage where they had a riot.
This is at Beavermouth?
Right at Beavermouth.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And at Beavermouth, this riot, they burned, previous to that, maybe I should say, my dad and Tietzel had in the neighborhood of $400,000 of their own money. So when these guys would turn in their time sheets, they would say, all right, we'll advance you 50% of that, you see. So they had quite a lot of money. And my dad had it all stored away in a tin trunk that he brought from the old country with him, you see. So anyways, this night came, and they set the pay office, which was an old boxcar, on fire. Mm-hmm. So my old man, first thing he did was grab
his money.
The money, and he run it down and put it beside the railroad track. Well, apparently, the railroad company, I think it was McMahon, but I'm not sure, had, realizing there was going to be trouble, had notified Sam Steele, who was the head of the RCMP then at Fort Steele. And he had come over there. He had two men over there. I guess they maybe notified him. And he came over there, but he had the flu, and he was in the road master's cabin, you see, at the bottom. And these guys started trouble, and these two officers of his arrested the guys and put them in jail. So the rest of the guys got together and they said, we're going to get these guys out. And they started down, the whole crews, you see, to get these guys out of the jail. And the roadmaster told Sam Steele, now I'm not a policeman, you got to get out and do something about that. But apparently he was pretty sick. But anyways, he come out there and he had a gun in his hand. And he says to these two officers of his, you walk up there and tell those guys to disband or else. So they said, well, they'll kill us. And he says, you walk up there. So he walked across the railroad track and he stood there. And according to my dad, he was shaking like a leaf. He says he hollered to the gang, the first one of you that touches one of my police officers gets it there. And he says, and you know I'm a good shot. Well, they disbanded the thing, but they came back later that night and got the man out. Anyways, after that, my dad and Tietzel decided that it was too hot from there. Well, I mean, they sent in the money, you see. Right. So they took their share out of it. Mm-hmm. And they headed for Revelstoke, you see, which was then known as Farwell.
Why would they have chosen Revelstoke? What was the attraction?
Well, that was, you see, the railroad was going through there, you see.
Right.
And the railroad wasn't finished yet. The last spike hadn't been driven yet. Anyways, my dad got to Revelstoke, and at that time he got a job to drive. To see, there was a controversy between Van Horn and this guy Farwell, who was an American. Farwell was an American, and he owned the landing down there on the lake, on the Columbia River Lake, you see. And the CPR were going to put their station there, but he wanted too much money for it, and Van Horn says, to hell with you, I'll put it up where it is now. So they did that. Well, my dad got the job of transporting the mail from the station down to the river bank for that year. Then come spring, he hired, I don't know who the name, I think the guy's name was Sanderson. So anyways, they had a catamaran, which is called a catamaran, which is actually two boats strapped together and the weight of the stuff coming, and they floated down the Columbia River, you see, to Sproat's Landing, which is now Robson.
Okay, so we're getting really close to home.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then from there, my dad, well, they hitched to ride in on the construction company. They were building the railroad from Sproats Landing to Nelson. It wasn't finished then. And they hitched to ride in as close to Nelson as they could get, and then they put the boat in the water again, and they started up the Kootenai Lake, you see. And eventually they arrived in Ainsworth. And I just forget what year that was, but it was before the 90s.
Right.
Because he was there.
So all the travelling was being done by rail and water?
Yeah.
There were no roads
No
that
roads,
were usable?
None whatsoever.
Or no roads at all?
No.
There may have been tracks, presumably.
Well, no, there was no railroad into Nelson even then.
Okay.
You see, there was no road to Nelson. The railroad later came to Proctor from Nelson, but there was no, up the main lake, there was no until up into the 50s. So, anyways, he went to Ainsworth, and he was rather fortunate, and he did pretty well in the mining over there, and he got to know everybody. He knew everybody, and I was just reading the paper this morning where Jake Fink died. Well, Jake Fink was there at that time. He was a big friend of my dad's in later years. And so they got into Ainsworth, and he spent a couple of years there. He ended up in, he went up to Caslow in '94. Actually, he went up there in '93. And he bought several lots there and sold them overnight. You know, you could sell lots.
Was he prospecting, or was
yeah,
he
was a
actually
prospector.
mining?
You know, he was a prospector. Then he went from Caslow through to Three Forks. Three Forks is between Sandon and New Denver.
All right.
And he mined there for a year, and he was very lucky. Made pretty good.
Okay, this is a very itinerant life. People are moving all the time. What kind of life did he live? He was single at that time.
Oh yeah, sure.
Did he have a horse? I mean, was this
well,
a method of transport?
Part of the time they went on horse. Most of the time was on foot.
Right.
Carried what they owned.
Right. Very little possessions.
Yeah.
At that time.
Sure. And so eventually, this was, as I say, around in '93 or so on there. Well, then he went back to the old country, you see, and having made a few bucks, he thought he should get married, you see. He had a lot of arguments with my grandmother. She didn't want him taking her daughter out to this god-awful country, but finally he won the argument and arrived back here, and he built a house in Three Forks, and this would be '89, like you see, and I was in there, and with my mother, they made some kind of a deal whereby he had to bring a nurse out with him. She was a qualified nurse called Mrs. Hesketh. So they stayed in Three Forks until I was to be born, you see, and one day this nurse says to my dad, "You better find a doctor." And it was about 6 or 8 miles down to New Denver, you see. So we had to go down there on snowshoes.
Yes.
And he went down there, and then he said he couldn't find the doctor. So he said he went to all the saloons in town, and finally he found the old bugger.
There was just a doctor in New Denver at that time for that whole area.
Yeah. So in the meantime, he'd got a horse from the livery stable, and he was looking for this doctor. Finally, when he found the doctor, he said the doctor was pretty tight. So he got the doctor, and he put him on the horse, and he put a bottle of scotch in each pocket so that he wouldn't fall off. Then he started in front of that horse. He said it was easier walking going home because he broke the trail going down.
Right. So
Anyway,
he's on snowshoes and
on
the horse is
snowshoes
behind.
and the horse behind him.
Meanwhile, your mother is waiting.
Wait, you can wait.
Yes.
Because when he got there, I had been born.
She hadn't waited.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this nurse had taken care of everything. So he said they put the doctor to bed and drank the booze.
That's a lovely story.
So
that's the way you came into the
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
In the winter.
Yeah, that was 29th of December.
Right.
29th of December. So you can imagine how much snow there was in those
Right,
days up
yes.
there.
What are your earliest recollection as a tiny one? What's the first thing you really
The first
remember?
thing I remember is living in Nelson here. They moved.
From Three Forks down to Nelson?
Actually, what happened after I was maybe 6 months old, my mother had to take me back to the old country to show me off, you see. So the old man sent her home. And while she was away, he built this house down here, which Lawton, the hockey player, lives in now. And the first thing I remember is we came back, you see, and there used to be a streetcar running up there. And there was an old guy called Bill Oliver, I got his picture in here somewhere, that had been in the Boer War, and he'd come out here to work for the CPR. He was a stonemason, you see, and he'd come out here. But he used to, having been in the Boer War, he was still a soldier in his own mind, and he had a gun, and he used to come down on the streetcar, and it would stop right in front of our place, and he'd get off there, and he'd have a gun. And Jesus, I thought that was great. And he would go up there and practice shooting on what is now the Rogers School. You see, at that time it wasn't no school, but, and that's what he practiced for. Old Oliver and I became friends later. But
now, what do you remember about the weather? I mean, I meet people in Nelson who say, "Oh, it's balmy now by comparison with what it used to be." What was it like?
Of course, I wouldn't know too much about that. I can tell you about that in later years when I lived up the lake. That winter we stayed in Nelson, but in the meantime, my dad still had these mining activities, and he moved from Three Forks to Poplar Creek. There was a big gold strike in Poplar Creek, and he built a store, a lumber yard, and one thing and another there, you see. And he'd spend the summer there, and then we'd spend the winter in Nelson, you see.
Right. Yeah. So he was sort of provisioning the prospectors. And
at that time,
yes.
yeah. But he was still a miner.
He was still a miner himself.
Yeah. And during that time, well, of course, I suppose that would be, well, it wouldn't be too many years after that, he staked the Alpine Mine, which is up above Sitkum Creek. But he didn't stake it from Sitkum Creek. He came in the other way, from the Slocan, you see, across that way, and staked this mine. And after years, when we moved up to Harrop and we stayed up there, my mother would be grumbling about not having enough money and one thing and another, and cost this and that and the other, and he'd always say, "Oh, we'll sell the Alpine, we'll be rich," you see. Well, he never did sell the Alpine, and he sold it to me later. He says to me, "Herb, I'll give it to you." And I said, "No, but you put a price on it, and I'll get my profit on it." So I sold it to Dick Harris and a guy called Sharp. But I only got $10,000 down. He sold it to me for 20, and I sold it to them for 50.
Okay, can I take you back a little bit, and let's go back to when you were a kid. When you said you were living in Nelson, and then you moved up to Harrop.
Yeah.
That's where you moved up the lake. I'd like to know something about what was Harrop like in those days. Why was it called Harrop?
Well,
how did it come to be called Harrop?
And see, from Poplar Creek, my dad the thing petered out up there, you see.
Okay, now Poplar Creek is on, where is that?
Way
Near Lardo, is it?
Up in the library,
Yes.
you see.
Okay.
So then he decided, or my mother decided for him, that mining was not
Yes.
a good thing.
Wasn't
So
a stable
she talked him into buying this place up. They didn't call it, at that time, they called it 13 Mile Point or Buchanan's Point or something. There was Buchanan had a sawmill up there for a while. So my dad bought that place up there, you see.
What date would that have been? Is it?
That would be about 1905 or 6.
Okay, right.
So we went up there. We'd stay there in the summertime and then come back to Nelson in the winter for the first couple of winters.
Right. How big an area are we talking about? What did he buy? A very
Well,
large acreage?
yes, he bought, I guess it was 40 acres. No, not 40 acres, 20 acres. Later we bought some other. But there was a house on it, which had been the bunkhouse, you see. So we fixed that up for a while. And around about 1908, I guess it was, or 9, the Great Northern Railroad was still running, and he got the post office, you see. But in those days, the mail came in through Spokane and down.
I heard about that.
Yeah,
Yes,
see?
American stamps.
Yeah, and the Caslow would wait at what they call Troop Junction, which is opposite Willow Point up there now, you see. And consequently, the mail would be very late at time coming, and I'd have to sit up quite often to get this up there. And but the Great Northern were so much better than the CPR. Oh, it wasn't funny. And it used to kind of irk my dad because he had worked, well, before it was the CPR, for them, you see. He worked on the old mud hen out of Rionville and up in that way with Dr. LeBeau, before Dr. LeBeau was a doctor. But anyways, we used to get the mail off. And then, of course, my mother decided that she should have a piano. That's a piano.
That's a beauty.
And
so,
Doctor...
where did it come from?
Well, yeah. Well, I guess that came from the old country. I don't know for sure.
They shipped it out.
Yeah.
Nice.
But
well, tell me something about Harrop then, the number of names you've mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, in that area, so the Harrop-Proctor area as I know it today,
Yeah.
Was there a sort of a settlement that
well,
had
we
some
were
kind
the settlement
of centre?
at that time.
Okay, by running a general store.
Yeah, everybody come in there.
Right.
And all the Englishmen that came from the old country came to our place first.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, we had that, you know, this guy that's on the TV here, Garner or something. Anyways, his father came to our place first. And then a guy called Bill Ridge, who afterwards worked with CMS for years, came out to our place to see. And of course we had lots of fun. There was never a dull moment.
Right.
They put me in a tent down on the beach to keep me out of the way. But I used to have to get up and light the fire in the morning.
How old were you when you were doing these kind of chores?
Well, it was just during the time I was going to school. I never started school until I was about 8.
Right.
The first school mistress that I went to was in a log school up there on a place which is now owned by the government of British Columbia, I guess, and they raise these fruit trees on these little wee trees, you know.
Right. That's on the Harrop side.
On the Harrop
yes.
side, sure.
Well, how many children were there in that area that you would need a school?
Well, how many was there? You saw them, and we dug out a thing the other day of a Dosenberger's. He had a directory, or would you call it a directory? And it showed there was 200 people. That was from Harrop to Proctor.
Mm-hmm.
So there was quite a lot around there, but there was a lot of people there, especially during the first part of the time that came out from Winnipeg and like that, you see.
Right.
But on the North Shore, previous to the First World War, everybody out there was a Navy man. There were more Navy men along the North Shore there than, well, if it hadn't been for the North Shore when the First World War came along, we wouldn't have had no Navy. That's right. Old Winston Churchill, he was not Winston Churchill, he was Winnie.
Mm-hmm.
He sent a wire to Commander Hallett out there 3 months before the war started. Get him home. And they got him home. Commander Burke, who was afterwards Commander Roland Burke, V.C., disappeared. We never saw him for 5 years. Commander Gordon Hallett, he ended up as the King's Messenger, whatever the King's Messenger is, I don't know. But he came back, he was in pretty bad shape. But he did take his family over there, and he had one daughter called Joan, who came back here and became a service nurse, and he had another daughter called Phyllis, and she died of shell shock over in there. Then there was Captain Cockerell, and he told me that he never put foot on land for 5 years. From the time he went there, he had 2 or 3 ships sunk under him, but they didn't take him back to land, they just gave him another ship. And Commander Roland Burke, he was half blind because he'd had an accident before he went over here with blowing stumps. And he couldn't see which way he went, but he had a pilot, I guess, that could. And I always used to kid him about this, you see, because he got the VC, because he was the guy that sank the ships and was strapped, or 4 was it there, and bottled up the German Navy, or the German submarine fleet.
Well, were these young men then? What were they doing? Why were they out here in
Well, they were more or less retired, but they pulled them back.
But they pulled them back for that war?
Oh, yes, sure.
Right,
The
because they were
captain,
experienced
yeah,
men.
there was Captain E.G. Westhead. Oh, there was, of course, and in those days, you know, the boats landing, you see. There were more stops on that boat going up there. If it was more than 20 feet, if it was an Englishman, the boat had to land for him. I can remember McClure John. McClure John was my godfather. I got the, what is it you call it here that I was christened in? Hanging up here somewhere. Gene cleaned it up the other day. Anyways, McClure John, Captain Seaman, the same Captain Seaman I was showing you about, he was a miserable old bugger, and he was on the CPR, you see, and he didn't care because there was 2 or 3 CPR boats running. But one day he wasn't going to stop for McClure John. And McClure John put a bullet right through the pilot house.
Did he stop?
Yeah.
Well, you were showing us a picture earlier. Maybe we should pull that one out. The men who built one of these paddle wheelers.
It was Captain Seaman. He's there.
He must be that side. Would you? Let's have a look. Did he get underneath here?
Oh, yeah, there.
I think that's. This is a. These are the men who.
That's the guys that built the steamer
Nelson.
Nelson in 1891.
And Captain Seaman is which one of these two?
That's Captain Seaman.
The man on the right with the hat.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. And look at all the big.
Watch chains.
Oh,
yes.
yeah, they all had those kind of things.
Right. They certainly didn't look like working men, the way they were dressed.
No, but in those days, you know, well, you can say what you like. The men got dressed up, and they look good. The miners, you know, even after you take up in. I can remember back. You see, of course, I run the first stage into Caslow. You see.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew everybody in Caslow. And I can remember those guys, miners up there, you see, and most of them were pretty well off, you know. The government bought the Knesukans to help the poor old CPR out, you see. And old Cap McKinnon was the skipper on there at that time, and of course he and I were buddies. And so I used to go over there all the time, and then Captain McPherson came in. Now there's some of the captains, somebody else. That's old Lawler. He was the purser. And when it come to punching my tickets, he looked the other way. And that's the guy, he was in the engine room, you see. And that's a guy called Becker. And that's McKinnon, that's another McKinnon. And that's Jack Annette. And Jack Annette had one leg taken off by the CPR when he got caught up in the road, you see. So Jack, he used to come to town. He'd always come down to see me, you see, and I'd drive him wherever we could go.
So this is the crew of the Nasukin,
yeah.
Right? Okay. What sort of time? I don't see any dates on this.
No, well, that would be in the, well, it would be, let's see, well, Russ Fletcher's father died in, just before the First World War, I guess.
So this is sort of 1916, 1917, something like that.
There's another picture. That is that's Bill Knoll, NAHL. And his son, I guess it's his stepson actually, is Russ Fletcher, and he lives down here now. He's a friend of mine.
And these were what, men from the Moyi?
Yeah.
Yes, right. Who's this man?
That's Captain Price. He was a captain in the Army. In the First World War, he was in Egypt, on going down, when they sent a bunch of men over from this country in Egypt. That's before your time. And then he came back, and they gave him a job on local Lanscombe here. And
was he the captain of the ferry then, when they put him on the Anscombe?
No, he was a purser.
Okay.
And he and Lord Aylmer up here, they used to drive me crazy because they wanted me to pay all the time. And I didn't approve of that.
You felt that you had a right to use the ferry?
Well, sure, I paid enough taxes. And this is Bill Knoll, who was the engineer. That's Sandy Sanderson. He was as I said before, he hit every wharf between here and Argenta.
You mean he stopped at every one?
No.
Or you mean he ran into
Yeah. Bloody well hit him too when he did it. I was standing on the Harrop ferry one day when he come down, and he run it in pretty close up to where the gangplank is, you see, and it took him 2 hours to get off. There's a picture of my first buses, but that was just after I'd sold them to the Greyhounds, you see. Well, it wasn't the Greyhound at that time.
This was a garage in Nelson?
Yeah, that's Nelson, yeah. You see?
Ride the Greyhound.
Well, that's what it says there. You see, I'd sold out. I was in the automobile business for them, but that was my bus.
That you were driving up and down to Caslow? Is this the bus?
No, that was the one I used to drive to Slocan City.
Okay.
And this one here was the one I used to drive to Caslow. I got another picture.
What is this, about a 20-seater or something like that? Will these buses have been?
Yeah.
Yes. And, I mean, were the buses full when you drove up and down?
Oh, Christ, we used to have them full, see them. Be hanging on the Bobby lot, and he used to ride on the roof. No, this was not.
And this was an all-year-round service? You would go up
when I first started, it wasn't an all-year-round.
Now, at what stage in your career were you, shipping or, acting as the agent shipping materials and people across? I mean, where are we up to in terms of you now?
Oh, well,
How old were you at that stage?
When I was running the bus into Caslow, you mean?
Right.
Oh, I started running the bus into Caslow about 25, I guess.
Okay.
1925. There was no road there until then. And when I started up there, we had to go. There was only one-way road, Old Judge,
just a narrow sort of.
Old Judge Brown here, who used to be the judge down here. He used to drive a Buick car, and I'd come along with the bus. And he couldn't get by me, and he'd get mad as hell when I wanted to run. And he said to me one day, "I've backed up 3 times for you now."
It's your turn.
Yeah. Oh, well, I was pretty good. I backed up normally. But one thing I'll say was that any of the traveling salesmen, and there was lots of them, they would always give you right away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What were they traveling in? They had cars?
Well, they had cars, yes. Mostly about that time would be, you see, I didn't start in the garage business until 1929.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, in Nelson at that time, how many cars were you able to sell? I mean, could you sell many
I sold
a year?
over 100 Ford cars in 1 year. I can show you.
Were you the only man selling
Oh,
cars
yes.
in Nelson?
No, but I was the only man selling Ford cars.
Right. Okay.
And Ford was the only man that was turning out any trucks to amount to anything, you see. Light deliveries and trucks. I could sell light deliveries to need help.
Okay, can you tell me what the price of a light delivery truck was in
Yes.
1930?
With a light delivery, we used to bring them in sometimes without the cab on, you see. Ford Motor Company had not incorporated the cab, so we had to buy the cab from the Brantford Body Company. They cost $200 and some dollars, but we could bring a chassis of a Ford light delivery in with a gas tank over the top, gravity feed, for $450. Of course, we had to pay $150 freight.
Yes, right. Brantford, Brantford, Ontario, you
Yeah.
were shipping the cabs in from.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a complete truck, you
Would be less
could
than
have-
$600.
yes.
I ran into a guy in the hospital up here last fall, and he started telling the girls up there, he'd known me how long, and he said he had asthma. I don't know why a Duke boy should have asthma, but he said he had. And I sold him a truck, and he said, "Do you remember the truck you sold me?" I said, "Of course I did. You still owe me $50 on it." And he laughed, and he said, "You know, I only paid you $450 for it." And I said, "Well, in other words, you only paid me $400. But he didn't get any body or any
Okay,
cab.
on that, right.
You see.
Yeah, so he could build his own on it.
Yeah,
That's-
well, he did,
Sure.
and he ran it.
Yeah.
He says, and it's still going. In fact, he says, "I'm coming up next summer to get a load of manure from you, and I ain't going to pay for the manure either."
That's
Yeah.
a big difference from the prices of today. no
Yeah,
question.
just
Incredible.
so bloody ridiculous.
Now, when you wanted to buy gas, were there lots of gas stations in Nelson?
Oh
Two,
yes,
three?
well,
Oh,
I had to buy at that time from the Shell Oil Company because I was under contract to them. Then when I moved up to where, you know where the Bank of Montreal is now, the Rudy Fisher's in there now. I still own the biggest share of that. I borrowed the money from the BA Oil Company. BA Oil Company loaned it me cheaper, and only charged me 3% for it. And
So there was a gas station there.
yeah,
And
the
were
gear there. And then Peebles had the had it there, and then a doctor, he had one. Oh yes, and Dill's service station, which is opposite the Legion. They were selling gas.
Right. So there was
Yeah,
4 or 5
we had
gas
lots
stations.
of competition.
Yeah. What was the price of a gallon of gas just out of
Oh,
interest?
Jesus, it was,
Do you recall?
I think about 30 to 35 cents, you see.
Yeah.
There's,
I can see that's a big black bear.
yeah.
Was he part of one of
I'm
your
not-
bus tours?
No, I'm not proud of killing things. But this one,
You're losing our book.
I had help doing it, and I had to do it because he was stealing my pigs. And a guy called Dennis Greenwood was working for me at that time. Here he is. And both of us shot him. We shot him at night, you see. And he's standing up in there with a pig under his arm.
He was a big fellow. no
Oh, he
question.
was a big guy. Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, now, where did you keep pigs?
This is over at Crawford Bay. That is on where if you golfed over it at there,
Kokanee Springs.
Kokanee
okay.
Springs.
Yes.
That's where it was. My barn, this big, I don't know if there's a picture of the barn. Yeah, there's
Yes.
part of it.
Right.
Only I extended it. I had 60 feet more on it before I quit.
Okay, well, where are we in the picture? You were running a bus line, you sold out to Greyhound, okay,
Yeah.
then you were selling cars in Nelson?
Well, then I took on the Ford agency.
Okay, and then how did you come to be at Crawford Bay with a farm when you were farming pigs?
Well, I got...
Was that all at the same period? You
Yes,
were doing all these things?
yeah. I used to go out there when I couldn't get anybody to... You know, it's pretty hard to get guys to work for you properly.
Right.
I'd leave here at 6 o'clock in the morning, catch the first ferry. And in those days, we didn't go over to Kootenai Bay, we went over to Gray's Creek. And
Right,
came around
yes.
there, you see,
Right.
got off there. And then I was the guy that talked Oscar Worsick into moving his sawmill over there. And he, at that time, was in Sandre, Alberta. And I got him to buy a place from Leonard Clark. Leonard Clark was a good friend of mine. And old Bill Fraser over there, I bought part of Bill Fraser's property. It's out in front of there now. That's something. My memory's not so good as it should be.
Well, tell me something. Okay, you were obviously farming. You were farming pigs. That was on a commercial basis, presumably.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was.
Were you farming other livestock besides?
Oh yeah, I
beside
had
pigs?
60 cows over there, milking 60 cows.
Mm-hmm.
And at times I used to deliver milk in Riondel.
You had a market on that side of,
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
lake. For
And then I sold to the palm dairies here.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was an economic thing to move the milk across the lake because you
Well,
were coming and going.
everybody said you couldn't make money doing it, but that was why I did it, just to show them that I could. Yeah, sure.